My name is Matthew J. Watts. I'm the senior pastor and the teacher of the Grace Bible Church, which is about 6 blocks from here, right on the Knoll Boulevard in Vine Street. And as Dr. Andrews indicated, I also serve as the president and founder of the Hope Community Development Corporation, which we established back in about 1993, basically to try to be a part of a revitalization and transformation of the west side of Charleston. And so our vision basically is to bring about community renewal, spiritual renewal, promote education, economic development, et cetera, in this neighborhood to create a model and a template, hopefully that can be used around the rest of the state. And so Dr. Andrews says that it's difficult to do. It's almost impossible to create safe, affordable, energy-efficient housing in a low-income neighborhood and treat the people fairly and justly. And I explained to you why that is the case. But it's an endeavor that we undertook, and we established an effort that we referred to as the Hope Neighborhood Housing and Economic Stabilization Initiative. You young people may not have been paying a whole lot of attention back in 2009, 2010, that area when there was this major financial crisis, a mortgage meltdown, when the greed of the mortgage industry put all these subprime loans out to people who could not afford them, and then these loans ballooned with these astronomical payments, and tens of thousands of foreclosures happened around the country. People lost everything they had. The greatest wealth transfer in the history of the United States of America in African American communities took place when all of these homes were foreclosed on, and it created a mess all over the country, even in West Virginia. So we tried to respond to that by creating a project in our organization to try to stabilize housing on the west side of Charleston, particularly in the historically African-American neighborhood, and which we'll tour part of that a little bit later. And so we had to borrow $250,000, almost $500,000. We leveraged that with some grant funding from the United States government, the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we leveraged that with another grant because our model was used by the state to create a statewide project. And so we were able to attract somewhere around $3 or $4 million to purchase houses, start a process of trying to rehab them, to get them in livable condition. So the way we were able to do it with that financial mousetrap, when you have a combination of loans, which you got to service debt, you got to pay those people back. But then you have some grants that allows you to kind of get the cost down in terms of renting to people, as well as to keep the cost down when you turn around and try to sell the houses. So the great challenge that we've had is actually trying to sell houses in this neighborhood, because all the property values in this community are severely depressed because of the decades of neglect, the number of vacant, slum and blighted properties, difficult to sell any property at the market value. Therefore, you not create real estate comps, and that's how real estate values are determined, right? What are houses selling in South Hills? What are houses selling even in Edgewood, which is an upper scale community right in the hills of here? And you can travel less than a quarter of a mile, half of a mile, and you will see a tremendous difference in the price of homes. A house on the west side that you might be to sell for $50,000 or $60,000, if you were fortunate to find a person that's bankable to get it, that same house would cost you probably $150,000 in South Hills. That's the type of economic disparity that kind of exists. So, but we're going to stay at it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and maybe that will tease you to create some questions, because I want to take at least a third of the time just to have you to respond to some of the things I'm going to say. I'm an African-American Black Baptist preacher, and my mentor is here, Reverend James Ely, and Black Baptist preachers, we're like jazz musicians. And so we study things, and we'll write out sermons, and then we'll get up and get ready to preach. And we will say, well, the Spirit of God is moving me to use my sanctified imagination. And we'll talk about something totally different from what we talked about. That's the genius of the black pulpit. So I prepared to talk about a couple of things, but listening to Dr. Andrews, I think I'm going to put on my jazz musician hat and kind of ad-lib just a bit. I think it'll be more interesting and more engaging for you. The West Side Story. the west side of Charleston story is a story. It's a history of slavery, segregation, systematic neglect, discrimination, exploitation. That's the history. The West Side's history began back in the 1840s and 50s. At that time, of course, West Virginia was a part of Virginia Commonwealth and had not yet become a state. And so the west side of Charleston was established not as the west side of Charleston, but as Elk City. It wasn't even a part of the city of Charleston proper. Those who are familiar with the city of Charleston, you know that there's this network of bridges that you crisscross back and forth the Kanawha and the Elk River. And the Elk River is the river that runs parallel to the interstate highway, just a half a mile or so down. And anything west coming this way past the Elk River was not a part of Charleston at that time. It was slave plantations. It was farming plantations. And there were 5 fairly significantly large slave plantations for this part of Virginia Commonwealth. The big plantations was on the other side. We had all the flat land, and tobacco was king in Virginia. And a few people realized that tobacco saved the United States of America. The United States of America would have never came into existence, would never survived financially had it not been for the tobacco crop. That's a whole other story. But in this part of Virginia Commonwealth, the mountains did not lend themselves to large plantations, but there was slavery. And the slaves worked in the coal mines, they worked in the timber mines, they worked in the coke factories, and they worked on farming plantations. So this west side had 5. And if you ride around Charleston, you'll find that there are historical markers, for example. Those who came across the Patrick Street Bridge, the Patrick Street Bridge was named after the Patrick family. They were slaveholders on the west side of Charleston. Those who are familiar with downtown are familiar with Ecoria Street, which is the main street that runs all the way from the East End all the way to Elk River. The Corias were slaveholders on the west side of Charleston. Some might be familiar with the name Rebecca Littlepage. Rebecca Littlepage was somewhat legendary. Her husband and they owned a slave plantation that's right there on, not too far from us. You could actually walk to where it is, and right off of Washington Street. And history says that her husband, I think, may have actually died in the war or died some kind of way accidentally, and she was left the slave plantation, and she defended her plantations with weapons, right, against the Southern Confederacy who came in. So that's the name of the little place, to Hunt Avenue. We may walk down Hunt Avenue. They were slave owners as well. And so that's the beginning of the west side of Charleston. And so with the end of slavery in 1863, 1865 actually, West Virginia had petitioned President Lincoln and the Congress to become a state. The only state born during the Civil War was the state of West Virginia. And West Virginia is one of the key strategic geographical areas because we're literally the gateway between the North and the South. And many important battles of the Civil War were fought here in West Virginia, including one here around the Kanawha Boulevard. You walk down the Kanawha Boulevard, you can see some of the historical markers, and they talk about the battle between the Union and the Confederate soldiers to get control of Charleston so they can control the Kanawha River and the Ohio River, which goes into the Mississippi, which is a major shipping lane, and which was critical to shut off commerce between the North and the South. West Virginia was incredibly important during the Civil War, and Charleston was an important place as well. So then after slavery ended, most black people left West Virginia. This was a hard place for black people to live during slavery, and they could see absolutely no future here for them, so most of them left. As a matter of fact, the founders of this state, when they petitioned the Congress in the original draft Constitution, they recognized that slavery would eventually end. They want no black people here. As a matter of fact, the Constitution, no, we don't want any black people to be in West Virginia. Of course, Lincoln wouldn't sign that document. So they cut a deal, and the deal was that West Virginia would be to keep their slaves. West Virginia is the only state exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation signed on June 1st, 1863. We were not a state, But we were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. At that time, there was about 20,000 black people in the state. Close to 19 of them were slaves.